June 18th, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell hit us first. Not fear, coffee. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing a cruel trick on me. Coffee was not a prison smell. Coffee belonged to kitchens, to mornings, to normal life. It belonged to places that had not been flattened by bombs or hollowed out by hunger. It certainly did not belong at the end of a journey that had begun with capture, whispers of execution, and weeks of waiting for something terrible to finally happen. The truck slowed, gravel crunching beneath its tires. Dust drifted up around us in slow, lazy clouds, glowing pale gold in the Texas sun. Someone knocked on the metal wall from the outside, not hard, not angry, just enough to announce our arrival. My hands tightened around the strap of the small cloth bag on my lap, the only thing I still owned. Inside it were a spare shirt, a photograph I had folded so many times the creases were nearly white, and nothing else that mattered. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head. They would shout. They would drag us down by our arms. They would make an example of someone. Maybe the one who looked weakest, maybe the one who looked defiant. They would starve us. That was how it was supposed to begin. The back of the truck opened and light poured in so suddenly I had to blink. Heat pressed against my face, dry and heavy. Nothing like the damp cold of Europe. I braced myself, shoulders tense, waiting for the first blow or the first scream. Neither came. A man stood just outside the truck, one hand resting on the wooden side panel. He wore a U.S. Army uniform, neatly pressed despite the dust, his helmet tilted back slightly as if he had forgotten to push it down. He looked at us, not with hatred, not even with curiosity, but with the expression of someone checking off a task on a long list. "Watch your step, ma'am," he said. Ma'am. The word landed harder than any slap could have. One by one, we climbed down. No one rushed us. No one grabbed our arms. Rifles hung on shoulders, yes, but they were pointed at the ground, slung like tools rather than threats. The guards did not shout. Some didn't speak at all. One of them yawned and rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, as if it were too early in the morning for all of this. I remember thinking that this was wrong. Not dangerous wrong, worse than that, confusing. They handed us water. Real water, cold enough that the metal cup stung my fingers. I hesitated, waiting for the order to drink or not to drink, waiting for the cup to be knocked away as punishment for something I hadn't understood. Nothing happened. The guard simply nodded, already turning to the next woman in line. The first sip made my throat ache. I hadn't realized how dry it was until then. Beyond the fence, the camp stretched out in neat rows of wooden barracks. Barbed wire glinted in the sunlight, but even that looked orderly, maintained. This was not the improvised chaos I had imagined. This was a place that had been built carefully, deliberately, as if someone had planned for us long before we ever arrived. We were led past a concrete structure where a water fountain trickled steadily, the sound soft and almost cheerful. One of the women beside me stared at it as if it were a miracle. Back home, fountains had been shut off years ago, pipes dismantled for scrap or shattered by bombs. Here, the water simply ran, waiting for whoever needed it. Inside the processing building, the air smelled sharply of soap. Strong, clean, unmistakable. Military soap, I would learn later. Efficient, unsentimental, made to strip dirt away without ceremony. The scent clung to the walls, to the wooden benches, to the very idea of order. It did not smell like fear. It smelled like routine. I looked down at the boots of the guard standing nearest to me. They were clean. Not polished for parade, not new, but cared for. The laces were tight, the leather intact. He shifted his weight slightly, clearly bored, clearly thinking about something else entirely. Maybe lunch. Maybe home. Certainly not us. A bored guard, I realized, was more terrifying than a violent one. Violence, I understood. Violence fit the stories we had been told. Boredom meant something else entirely. It meant this place was not fueled by hatred. It meant we were not special. we were just another problem to be managed, another responsibility in a country already drowning in responsibilities. Because while we stood there, blinking in the sun, America was fighting a war on a scale we had never truly understood. More than 12 million American men were in uniform by then, scattered across oceans and continents. Normandy was burning. Italy was still bleeding. The Pacific was a name spoken with dread. And still, this country had room for us. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners shipped across the Atlantic and planted in the middle of places like Texas, far from the front lines, far from revenge. Texas had become a kind of rear world, a vast holding ground where war was managed rather than fought. Endless land, endless sky, enough space to lock enemies away without needing to destroy them. We were told where to stand. We stood. We were told to wait. We waited. No one struck us for standing wrong or waiting too slowly. No one insulted us. When someone stumbled from exhaustion, a guard stepped forward instinctively, not to punish, but to steady her, his hand hovering for a moment as if unsure whether touching us was even allowed. I kept waiting for the moment when the truth would reveal itself, the moment when the kindness would crack and show its cruelty underneath. That was how traps worked, after all. You did not lure someone with horror. You lured them with calm. But as the minutes passed, nothing happened. The sun moved higher. Somewhere nearby, a screen door slammed softly. A radio played faintly in the distance. Music, not marching, drifting on the air and vanishing. Again. The smell of coffee returned, stronger now, mixed with something fried and savory that made my stomach twist painfully. I thought of what we had been told, that America was brutal, that Americans were savages hiding behind machines, that capture was worse than death. Standing there, thirsty but not beaten, frightened but not harmed, I felt something far more dangerous than fear begin to form. Doubt. If this was prison, then nothing I understood about the world made sense anymore. And if this was America, quiet, methodical, almost indifferent in its mercy, then the enemy we had been taught to hate did not exist in the way we had imagined. That was the first shock. Not the fences, not the guards, but the realization that somewhere, far beyond this camp, an entire country had decided that even its enemies would be fed, washed, and spoken to like human beings. And I understood, dimly, that once you see that, you can never unsee it. The first night taught us that shock wears off faster than fear. Daylight had made the camp seem almost reasonable. Sunlight softened edges. Order looked harmless when you could see it clearly, but night erased those illusions. When the barracks lights dimmed and the air filled with unfamiliar sounds, the creak of wood, the distant cough of an engine, the endless Texas insects, our minds returned to where they had been trained to live. In the dark. We lay on narrow bunks arranged in neat rows, each bed exactly the same distance from the next, as if symmetry itself were meant to calm us. It didn't. My body stayed rigid long after exhaustion begged me to sleep. I kept my boots on, laces loose but ready, my feet resting on the edge of the mattress so I could swing them down in an instant. Around me, others did the same. No one said we should. No one had to. We had learned this long before capture. Sleep was dangerous. Someone whispered my name. Then another voice answered, barely louder than breath. Words moved through the room like contraband, passed carefully from bunk to bunk. What do you think happens tomorrow? They're waiting. For what? For us to stop watching. Every rumor we had carried across Europe came crawling back once the lights went out. During the day, we could pretend the Americans were simply strange. At night, propaganda found its voice again, patient and persuasive. They told us America was a place without rules, a country of brute force disguised as smiles. We had seen posters, American soldiers drawn with distorted faces, their hands oversized and bloody, their eyes empty. We had listened to broadcasts warning us that captured women were not prisoners but trophies. that we would be humiliated, studied, used. Back home, fear had been fed carefully, like a ration. Repeated often enough, it stopped sounding like exaggeration and started sounding like truth. Now, lying in clean barracks with wool blankets pulled to our chins, we tried to reconcile those stories with what we had seen. The mind does not like contradiction. When it finds one, it chooses the version that feels safer. And fear, we had learned, was safer than hope. Someone began to cry quietly near the far wall. Not sobbing, just the soft broken sound of breath catching again and again. No one moved to comfort her. Comfort required closeness, and closeness required trust. We had not learned how to do that anymore. I stared at the ceiling, counting knots in the wood. I did not turn my back to the room. None of us did. Turning your back meant you believed nothing would happen. That belief felt reckless. Every creak sounded like footsteps. Every pause felt deliberate. At some point, a guard passed outside. His shadow slid across the small window and vanished. He did not stop. He did not look in. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made my stomach tighten. If they were not watching us closely, what did that mean? The next day brought routines, and routines brought new fears. We were separated into lines for processing. Names, numbers, medical checks. Nothing invasive, nothing violent. Still, the word spread quickly when someone overheard an American officer speak to a translator. Showers will be scheduled. The reaction was immediate and visceral. One woman dropped her cup. Another grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. A third pressed both hands over her mouth and shook her head, eyes wide as if refusing the word itself might make it disappear. Shower. In Germany, that word had been poisoned. We did not speak it lightly. We did not speak it at all. I won't go, someone whispered. They'll force us, another replied. That's when it happens. No one needed to explain what it was. I saw a girl named Marta. She had been a typist before the war, barely 20, sink down onto a bench and begin to cry openly, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. A guard glanced over, uncertain, then looked away again, clearly unsure what to do with a crying enemy. I wanted to tell her it would be all right. The words formed in my mind, rehearsed and hollow. I did not say them. I did not believe them. Fear does not require evidence. It only requires memory. At night, the whispers returned, sharper now, more urgent. They're separating us on purpose. They're testing who breaks first. Why else would they be so calm? We searched the days for signs of cruelty the way one searches a room for a hidden weapon. We watched hands, eyes, voices. Every kindness was examined for its hidden cost. The Americans continued behaving in ways that made no sense. They brought food at the same times every day. They gave us soap again when the first bars were gone. They did not rush us. They did not mock us. Some barely looked at us at all. That was the most unsettling part. Back home, everything had been loud. Orders shouted, slogans repeated, enemies named and renamed until hatred became a habit. Here, no one explained. Themselves. No one tried to convince us of anything. We were simply kept. I began to understand something then, though I did not yet have words for it. The war we had known was built on constant tension. The war they were fighting here was built on logistics, on schedules, on systems large enough to absorb even their enemies without collapsing. Women like us had never been part of that calculation before. The Geneva Convention had been written with men in mind. Soldiers, officers, ranks. Women had been footnotes if mentioned at all. There were no clear rules for what to do with captured female auxiliaries. No precedent. No script. That uncertainty terrified us more than violence would have. When there are no rules, anything feels possible. I kept my boots on every night. I slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound. I memorized the layout of the barracks, the distance to the door, the pattern of the guards' patrols. Not because I planned to escape, but because planning was the only thing that kept panic from swallowing me whole. During the day, I watched the Americans when they thought no one was watching. I saw them write letters. I saw them argue about cigarettes. I saw one man carefully tape a photograph inside his locker, a woman, smiling, holding a baby. At night, I remembered the voices from home. Do not trust them. Mercy is a trick. They want you confused. Propaganda is not loud when it works best. It is intimate. It sounds like your own thoughts. By the third night, exhaustion finally dragged me into sleep. I dreamed of doors that would not open and water that never turned off. I woke with my heart racing, convinced something had already happened and I had somehow missed it. Nothing had. That was the most frightening thing of all, because fear thrives on certainty, and America was offering us none. Only silence, order, and time. And in that space between what we had been told and what we were experiencing, something dangerous began to grow. Not trust. Questions. And once questions appear, no amount of shouting or slogans can make them disappear again. By the fourth morning, fear had not disappeared, but it had begun to lose its sharpest edges. It did not retreat all at once. It thinned, the way fog does when the sun rises slowly and without drama. Nothing announced the change. There was no moment when we looked at one another and agreed we were safe. Safety was too large a word. What happened instead was smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous to everything we had been taught. Nothing bad happened. Not once, not by accident, not by delay. Breakfast arrived at the same hour every day. We lined up in silence, trays in our hands, shoulders tight, still half expecting the rules to change without warning. The mess hall was plain. Long wooden tables, bare walls, open windows that let the Texas air drift through. The smell was always the same when we stepped inside. Coffee first, then soup, something starchy and filling beneath it all. A man behind the counter slid a steel tray toward me. The metal was cool against my palms. On it sat a slice of white bread, real white bread, soft and pale, and a bowl of soup that sent steam curling upward into my face. The smell made my stomach twist in a way that felt almost painful. I waited. Old habits die slowly. No one shouted at me to move. No one grabbed the tray back. The guard standing nearby watched with an expression so neutral it almost felt impolite. I realized with a flicker of disbelief that he was waiting for me. So I moved. I sat at the table with the others, the tray heavy in my hands, as if it might vanish if I set it down. The soup was hot enough that I had to blow on it. I watched the surface ripple, my reflection wobbling there for a moment, and thought of kitchens that no longer existed. We ate carefully at first, slowly, not because we were instructed to, but because speed felt dangerous. I tore the bread in half, then quarters as if smaller pieces were less likely to be taken away. Around me, spoons dipped into soup, paused, dipped again. No one spoke. When nothing happened, we ate faster. That was the first small thing. No speeches, no announcements, just food given and not reclaimed. After breakfast, we were issued soap again. Each of us. One bar, wrapped in thin paper, stamped with block letters that meant nothing to us. It was not luxurious. It was not perfumed. It was solid, practical, clearly made to be used without ceremony. Still, the sight of it made several women hesitate. A guard set the box down and stepped back, hands behind his back as if to make it clear that nothing else was expected. I took one, feeling its weight, its edges sharp and new. For a moment I wondered if this was a test, if those who took it would be marked somehow. But everyone took one. Later, in the barracks, I unwrapped mine slowly. The smell rose immediately, clean and blunt. I pressed the soap to my nose without thinking and felt something unexpected tighten in my chest. The scent was not American or German. It was universal. Cleanliness without meaning attached to it. That was the second small thing. No sharing. No rationing among ourselves. No instructions on how much we were allowed. The Americans did not seem interested in controlling our gratitude. They spoke to us, when they spoke at all, the way one speaks to someone who does not yet know the language, not loudly, not sharply, but slowly, as if time itself were generous. A guard pointed toward the wash area and repeated himself with patience when no one moved at first. Another demonstrated how the line would work, stepping forward, stepping aside, his hands open and visible the entire time. No touching. That mattered more than I expected it to. In Germany, authority was physical. It leaned close. It corrected posture with hands. Here, authority stayed at a distance. It gestured. It waited. We began to notice the objects that shaped their days. The steel trays, scratched and dented, reused without concern for appearance. The canteens clipped to belts, swinging slightly as the guards walked. The forks and spoons, real utensils, not improvised, not hoarded, stacked neatly at the end of each table. And, always, the coffee. Every morning, the smell came before the sun was fully up. It drifted through the camp as if it belonged there, as if war had not interrupted this particular ritual. Guards drank it from dented cups, leaning against posts, talking quietly among themselves. Sometimes one would glance at us, not suspiciously, but absent-mindedly, the way people look at something that has already become familiar. That familiarity frightened me. I had been taught that Americans were excessive, indulgent, incapable of discipline, yet nothing here felt wasteful. Everything felt sufficient. Enough food, enough water, enough order to keep chaos away without needing cruelty to enforce it. It was only later that I understood why. These men had grown up with nothing. The guards who watched us were not aristocrats or ideologues. They were sons of farmers and factory workers, raised during years when breadlines stretched down city blocks and hunger was a shared language. The Great Depression had shaped them long before the war did. Sharing was not a moral lesson to them. It was a habit. You fed people because that was how everyone survived. America, I began to realize, was not being kind to us by accident. It was being methodical. Humane treatment was not weakness here. It was strategy. Well-fed prisoners did not riot. Clean prisoners did not spread disease. Treated decently, enemies became manageable. There was no need for hatred when efficiency worked better. This idea unsettled me more than violence would have. If cruelty was unnecessary, then everything we had been taught about strength was wrong. Days passed, each one almost indistinguishable from the last. Meals arrived. Soap was replaced. Directions were given calmly. No one shouted unless there was an emergency. And even then, the urgency was aimed at the problem, not at us. Slowly, imperceptibly, something inside us shifted. We stopped clutching our trays like shields. We began to sit closer together. Someone laughed once, sharply, then covered her mouth in surprise. At night, I still slept lightly. I still kept my boots near, but I noticed that I no longer woke at every sound. The insects outside became background noise instead of threats. The footsteps of the guards faded into rhythm. I found myself watching the Americans with a different kind of attention now, not searching for danger, but for understanding. I saw how they folded letters carefully before slipping them into pockets. I saw how one man saved half his bread roll and wrapped it for later, not because he was afraid of hunger, but because wasting food simply did not occur to him. This, I thought, is how my grandparents might have lived, if the world had been kinder. That thought startled me. It was dangerous to humanize the enemy, more dangerous still to admire them. Yet admiration crept in anyway, quiet and uninvited, not for their power, but for their restraint, for the way they did not need to prove themselves to us. They fed us because feeding people was normal. They gave us soap because clean bodies were easier to manage. They spoke to us slowly because shouting was unnecessary. They did the smallest things. And those smallest things, repeated every day without pause or praise, began to do what bombs and propaganda never could. They made us question everything we thought we knew about strength, about victory, about what kind of country wins a war by refusing to become cruel. By the end of the week, I caught myself thinking something I would not have dared to say aloud. If this was America, then perhaps the stories we had been told were not meant to prepare us for the enemy at all. Perhaps they were meant to prepare us to hate something that did not exist. The order came without ceremony. No sirens, no raised voices, just a translator standing at the front of the barracks, reading from a clipboard as if announcing a work schedule. "Bathing will begin this afternoon," she said. "You will go in groups." The room went still. I felt it before I understood it, a tightening, collective and immediate, like a wire pulled too fast. Someone inhaled sharply. Another woman's hand flew to her mouth. The word bathing hung in the air, thin and dangerous, translated too cleanly to soften its meaning. Shower. The smallest word carried the heaviest weight. Fear rushed back in all at once, not gradually as it had faded, but violently, like a door kicked open. Chairs scraped the floor. Someone whispered no again and again, the sound breaking apart as if it could be torn into harmless pieces. A woman near the wall began to shake so hard her teeth clicked audibly. This was the moment we had been waiting for. This was the trap. Everything before, food, soap, patience, had been preparation. That was how it made sense in our minds. Kindness was not real. Kindness was bait. You did not feed people and wash them unless you wanted something from them afterward. We had seen the posters. We had heard the broadcasts. We had learned, carefully and thoroughly, what happened to women who trusted the enemy. Someone grabbed my arm, nails dug into my skin. "They're separating us," she whispered. "This is where it happens." No one argued. If the Americans had wanted to frighten us, they could not have done it more effectively than by remaining calm. The guards outside the barracks did not change their posture. No one rushed in. No one barked orders. The lack of urgency made everything worse. When our group was called, my legs felt hollow beneath me. I stood because standing was expected. I walked because the woman in front of me walked. The line moved without resistance, like a procession whose destination everyone understood but no one named. The building was low and rectangular, its windows fogged slightly from steam. The smell reached us before we stepped inside. Soap, again, stronger now, mixed with something metallic and clean. Water. I tasted panic at the back of my throat. Inside, the room was larger than I expected. Concrete floors, drains, rows of pipes running along the walls, each fitted with a simple metal shower head. No curtains, no doors, nothing to hide behind. The openness made my heart race. We stopped just inside the entrance, clustered together instinctively, shoulders touching. I could feel the tremor in the woman beside me, the way her breath came in short, uneven bursts. An American woman stood near the far wall, wearing a uniform different from the guards. She spoke quietly to the translator. I watched her hands. They were empty. No clipboard, no instruments. Nothing that looked like authority or threat. "Undress," the translator said. A sound rose from the group. Not a scream, but something closer to disbelief, raw and helpless. No one moved. I felt my body lock, muscles refusing the command as if obedience itself would be a betrayal. The American woman raised her hands slightly, palms open. She said something softly. The translator hesitated, then spoke again. She says, "She will go first." Before any of us could understand what that meant, the American stepped out of her shoes, then her uniform blouse. She moved without haste, without looking at us, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. When she reached the pipes, she turned one of the handles. Water burst forth. The sound filled the room instantly, loud, unmistakable, impossible to reinterpret. Clear streams struck the concrete floor and splashed upward, catching the light. Steam rose. The smell of soap intensified. No screams, no alarms, no sudden violence. Just water. The American woman stepped beneath it and let it soak her hair, her shoulders, her back. She closed her eyes, tilting her head slightly, and for a moment she looked like anyone else at the end of a long day. Tired, human, unconcerned with us entirely. I felt something inside me crack. Not break, crack. A thin, jagged line splitting a belief I had held so tightly it had shaped my bones. One by one, the women around me began to cry. Not quietly, not politely. The sound rose in waves, sharp sobs, gasps for breath, voices breaking as if something long compressed had finally been allowed to escape. A woman dropped to her knees near the door, her hands pressed flat against the floor, shoulders shaking violently. Another clutched the bar of soap she had been given earlier as if it were an anchor, pressing it to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. I saw someone laugh suddenly, hysterically, then collapse against the wall as if her legs could no longer support her. I stood frozen, watching water run down the drain, watching the American woman step aside and gesture gently toward the open space beneath, the showers. No one touched us. No one hurried us. Eventually, my hands moved on their own. I set my shoes down carefully, as if order might still matter. My fingers fumbled with buttons that suddenly felt too small, too complicated. I could not remember the last time I had undressed without fear. When I stepped under the water, it was warm enough to make me gasp. It struck my scalp, my shoulders, my back, and ran down my spine in steady streams. I expected pain. I expected burning. I expected something to go wrong. Nothing did. The water soaked through layers of dirt and sweat and memory, carrying them away in thin gray rivers that disappeared into the drain. I closed my eyes, and before I could stop myself, tears came, hot and relentless, indistinguishable from the water pouring over my face. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, knees drawn up, my arms wrapped around myself. Around me, others did the same. The room filled with the sound of crying. Not fear now, but release so sudden it left us gasping. I had prepared myself to be destroyed. I heard myself say the words tearing free without permission. They only wanted me clean. No one answered. No one needed to. The breakdown was not dramatic in the way stories like to make it. There was no single scream, no collapse that drew attention. It was quieter and far more complete than that. It was the sound of defenses falling apart because they were no longer needed. Some women stayed beneath the water far longer than necessary, as if afraid it might vanish if they stepped away. Others finished quickly and wrapped themselves in towels, sitting in silence, eyes unfocused, hands trembling. The American woman remained nearby the entire time, never closer than necessary, never farther than respectful. When the last of us had finished, she turned the handles herself, shutting off the water. The sudden quiet felt enormous. We dressed slowly, awkwardly, still shaking. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. When we stepped back outside into the Texas sun, clean and exhausted and undone, the camp looked different. Not kinder, not safer, smaller. As if the walls had moved back slightly, or perhaps we had grown larger inside them. That was the moment everything changed. Not because America had proven itself good, but because it had proven something more unsettling. It did not need our fear. And in that realization, something we had carried since the war began, something heavy and corrosive, finally slipped from our hands and shattered on the floor, leaving us stunned by the sound it made. We were still prisoners, but for the first time, we were no longer bracing for the end. The morning after the showers, the camp felt quieter. Not in the way a place grows silent after punishment, but in the way a house does after a storm has passed through it. Everything still standing, but rearranged. We moved differently, slower, less guarded, as if our bodies were still learning the shape of a world where the worst thing had not happened. I expected the Americans to change too, to become colder now that they had seen us undone. That was how power usually worked. You offered mercy once, then reminded people you did not have to offer it again. They did nothing of the sort. Breakfast arrived as it always had. Same hour, same steel trays, same white bread and hot coffee. No glances, no smirks, no acknowledgement of what had happened the day before. It was as if the breakdown had belonged entirely to us, and they had never noticed. That unsettled me more than anything else. When you grow up under constant judgment, you come to expect it everywhere. You brace for it, search for it, build your life around avoiding it. Here, judgment seemed unnecessary. I sat at the table with my hands wrapped around the warm mug, watching steam rise and disappear. Across the room, 2 guards leaned against a support beam, talking quietly. One of them held a deck of cards, shuffling absent-mindedly, the sound soft and rhythmic. "You play?" he asked his companion. The question caught me off guard, not because it was asked, but because it was asked so casually, as if the war were not hanging over everything, as if this moment belonged to them and to nothing else. They sat at a nearby table during their break, spreading the cards between them. No tension, no bravado. Just 2 men killing time the way men always have. One of the women at my table watched them for a long moment before speaking. "They're just waiting," she whispered. "Waiting for what? For letters, for orders, for the war to end." It occurred to me then that captivity had not begun for us when we were taken prisoner. It had begun much earlier. For them, too. Years ago, when the world decided young men would stop being sons and start being soldiers. The more I watched the guards, the harder it became to fit them into the shape of the enemy we had been given. They talked about home when they thought we could not understand. About farms and streets and towns whose names meant nothing to us. About mothers who sent cookies and care packages and worried they were stale by the time they arrived. About sisters who were suddenly working in factories, doing jobs no one had imagined women doing before the war. One man complained quietly that his mother still tried to cut his hair when he visited, as if he were 12. The others laughed, not cruelly, fondly. Mother. That word landed somewhere deep inside me. I thought of my own mother, and of how little time I had spent thinking about her once the war had begun. There had been no room for that kind of softness. Softness was dangerous. Softness made you hesitate. Yet here were these men, carrying rifles by day and speaking of their mothers by night, without apology. They did not perform kindness. They did not announce it. They did not use it to make a point. They simply lived it. I began to see the camp not as a stage, but as a system. One so large and confident it did not need cruelty to maintain control. America had already won something long before the war ended. It had won the ability to be patient. Its factories ran without pause. Its farms produced more food than it could use. Its trains crossed distances we could barely comprehend. This country did not need our suffering to prove its strength. That was the part propaganda had never prepared us for. We had been taught that power screamed, that it demanded recognition, that it crushed opposition publicly to discourage resistance. Here, power looked like paperwork, schedules, supply chains, and men bored enough to play cards while guarding their enemies. This realization did not come all at once. It crept in through small observations. A guard offering his jacket to another guard without comment when the evening cooled. A man setting aside his coffee for a moment to help someone fix a jammed gate. Another carefully folding a letter before tucking it into his pocket, reading it again later as if the words might change. They did not need us to fear them. They needed us to behave. And behavior, I was beginning to understand, was easier to manage than terror. One afternoon, as we waited in line for supplies, a guard dropped a small stack of cards. They scattered across the dirt. Instinctively, I bent down to help gather them before I remembered myself and froze. He smiled, quick, embarrassed, and knelt down too. "Thanks," he said, taking the cards from my hand without brushing my fingers. That was all. No significance attached to it. No acknowledgement of the moment. He stood and walked away, already absorbed in something else. I stared after him, my heart beating faster than it had any right to. If this was the enemy, then who were we? Back home, we had been told that Americans were soft, that they relied on machines because they lacked discipline, that they had no real culture, no real endurance, and yet here they were, disciplined without rigidity, orderly without fear, capable of enormous violence elsewhere while refusing it here. That contradiction gnawed at me. I began to think about the war differently, not as a clash of armies, but as a test of what kind of strength would last. Germany had bet everything on force and obedience. America had built something slower, heavier, harder to stop. Strength here was not about domination, it was about capacity. The capacity to feed millions. The capacity to fight across oceans. The capacity to hold prisoners without needing to break them. This was not mercy born of weakness. It was mercy born of confidence. That understanding changed the way I carried myself. I no longer flinched at every raised voice. I no longer searched faces for signs of impending cruelty. I watched instead for patterns, for how systems functioned when no one was trying to prove anything. At night, when the guards' voices drifted through the camp, I listened differently. I heard homesickness beneath their jokes, weariness beneath their routines. I heard men who wanted the war to end not so they could celebrate victory, but so they could return to lives that had been waiting without them. Lives with mothers who worried, with kitchens that smelled like coffee, with tables where cards were spread not to pass time, but to enjoy it. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, and felt something settle inside me. Heavy, uncomfortable, irreversible. We had been taught to believe that the enemy was less human so that killing them would feel justified. What no one had prepared us for was an enemy so human that hatred became impossible to sustain. If this was America, quietly powerful, methodical, unafraid of decency, then the world I had been told I was defending no longer existed in the way I thought it did. Power without cruelty. That was the phrase that stayed with me. And once you understand that such power exists, you can no longer pretend that brutality is inevitable. You begin to see it instead for what it is, a choice. One that America, in this place and at this moment, had decided not to make. And that decision, more than any weapon or victory parade, told me who had already won something far greater than the war itself. The question did not come to me during the war. It arrived years later, quietly, without warning, when the danger had long passed and memory had softened at the edges. I was older then. The world was supposed to be settled. The war had been packed away into museums and textbooks, its dates memorized, its victories neatly labeled. I had crossed an ocean again, not as a prisoner this time, but as a visitor, invited to speak, to remember, to stand in places that no longer belonged to fear. That was when I found myself wondering. I wonder what happened to that America. The America I remembered did not shout. It did not explain itself constantly. It did not need to. In 1944, it had been too busy doing things, building, feeding, transporting, winning, to argue about who it was. Identity was not home, still played cards, still believed the future was something worth returning to. I wondered if Americans today could feel proud of that without apology. Because from where I stood, someone who had once been their enemy, the America of 1944 had not been great because it was flawless. It had been great because it was sure enough of itself to be decent. And I found myself hoping, quietly, that remembering that version of America might help this one find its way back to something it had not entirely lost, only misplaced beneath too much noise. We used to be better, they sometimes say. I'm not certain that is true, but I am certain of this. They once knew how to be strong without being cruel, and that knowledge once learned does not vanish forever. The letters began arriving long after the uniforms were folded away. Not during the war, not even immediately after. They came decades later, written in careful handwriting by people who had not been alive when the events took place but who carried them anyway, like heirlooms passed down without instruction. My grandfather never spoke much about America, one letter began. But when he did, his voice changed. Another arrived from a woman who had found a small wooden cup among her father's belongings after he died. Inside it, carved so faintly it could almost be missed, was a single word: thanks. She had no idea where it came from until she traced his path through history and found a camp in Texas that no longer existed as it once had. These were not grand confessions. They were not political statements. They were quiet acknowledgments, written by children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing fragments of a story that never quite fit the version of the war they learned in school. My grandmother said she learned what dignity felt like in an American prison camp. My father told us he survived the war because Americans fed him when they did not have to. They gave him water first. That's what he always remembered. I read these letters slowly, carefully, as if speed might cheapen what they carried. Each one was different in detail, but identical in tone. Gratitude without demand. Memory without accusation. What struck me most was what they did not say. They did not praise America for winning. They did not celebrate defeat or victory. They did not compare numbers or strategies or flags. They remembered moments. A cup of water, a bar of soap, a meal placed on a tray and not taken back, a voice that said, "Ma'am," when it did not have to say anything at all. Those were the gifts that endured. Some gifts don't rust. I had carried my own memories quietly for many years, unsure where they belonged. Gratitude can be an awkward thing for former enemies to express. It sits uneasily beside history's larger truths. But reading those letters, I realized something important. The story had never been mine alone. It had lived on in kitchens and living rooms, in half-finished sentences and gestures that made no sense until someone asked the right question. It had traveled across generations not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. And truth, when it is simple enough, survives even when everything else is forgotten. I thought of the Americans who guarded us. Young men who never imagined they were doing anything worth remembering. They had not acted for history. They had acted for order, for habit, for the quiet rules they had learned growing up. They had no idea that their restraint would one day be remembered as mercy, or that their boredom, their patience, their refusal to humiliate would echo across decades. They were part of a generation that believed decency did not need applause, that strength did not need cruelty to validate it, that even in war, some lines did not have to be crossed. Those beliefs were not written into law. They were lived, and because they were lived, they lasted. Today, when I speak to Americans whose grandparents served in that war, I see something shift behind their eyes. Pride, yes, but not the loud kind. The deeper kind. The kind that recognizes a moral inheritance rather than a political one. They do not ask whether the country was perfect. They ask whether it was capable of restraint, capable of generosity, capable of seeing enemies as human beings without surrendering victory. The letters from German families continue to arrive. Sometimes they include photographs, faded, creased, handled so often the edges are soft. A young, massive machine moving in one direction. Factories ran day and night. Farms stretched farther than the eye could see. People argued, certainly, but when the argument ended, they went back to work. The war demanded it. Decades later, standing on American soil again, I sensed something different. The noise was louder now. Voices clashed where they once overlapped. People spoke of enemies everywhere, sometimes foreign, sometimes domestic. Lines were drawn not by oceans, but by opinions. The certainty I remembered had been replaced by suspicion, the quiet confidence by constant explanation. I watched Americans argue about history as if it were a possession rather than a responsibility. In 1944, history had been something you were living through, too busy surviving to curate. People did not ask whether the country was good. They asked whether it was necessary, and then they made it so. I visited towns that had once hummed with industry and found silence where machines used to sing. Brick buildings stood empty, windows boarded, their purpose forgotten. In my memory, America had always been producing planes, ships, food, certainty. The scale of it had been overwhelming, almost frightening. Now, the scale felt smaller, fragmented. I did not say this aloud. It was not my place. I had been a guest here once under very different circumstances, and gratitude still sat heavily in my chest. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. In 1944, Americans did not need to remind one another who they were. They knew. They were the people who fed prisoners because feeding people was what capable nations did. They were the people who followed rules not because they feared punishment, but because order made everything else possible. They were the people who believed, quietly, stubbornly, that decency was not a weakness, even in war. That belief had been shared, widely, almost instinctively. Now it seemed harder to find. I met Americans whose parents or grandparents had served in the war. They spoke with a softness in their voices when they mentioned those years, as if touching something fragile. Many of them told me the same thing in different words. It was simpler then. People pulled together. We knew what mattered. They said this not with arrogance, but with longing, as if they were describing a house they had grown up in but could no longer find on any map. I thought back to the guards at Camp Hearn, the ones who shuffled cards, who spoke of their mothers, who carried rifles without needing to brandish them. They had not thought of themselves as exceptional. They had simply acted the way they had been raised. The greatest generation, they would later be called. A name that sounded almost too grand for men who had never claimed greatness for themselves. They would not have understood the title. They would have waved it away, embarrassed. They had been children of scarcity, molded by hardship, taught that survival depended on cooperation. When war came, they applied the same lessons at a national scale. Work together. Waste nothing. Feed everyone who needs feeding. That America had not been perfect. I knew that better than most. It had its cruelties, its blind spots, its injustices. But it had possessed something that felt rare now. Moral confidence. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that did not require constant affirmation. The kind that allowed a country to win a war and still look at its enemies as human beings. As I listened to modern debates, to anger flaring where patience once lived, I felt an unexpected sadness. Not for myself, but for the Americans who no longer seemed sure what they had inherited. They were searching for something their grandparents had practiced without naming. Unity, purpose, restraint. I wondered if they knew that these things had once existed not as ideals, but as habits, that they had been lived daily in places like prisoner of war camps in Texas, far from the front lines, where young men guarded enemies and still spoke of home, still when the edges are soft. A young man in uniform, a woman smiling awkwardly, a face that once stood on the other side of a fence. The writers often apologize for their English. They do not need to. Gratitude has its own grammar. They write because they want Americans to know that something their country did, quietly, without ceremony, still matters. That the way prisoners were treated did not end when the camps closed. It continued invisibly in families who rebuilt their lives carrying an unexpected lesson. That power does not have to humiliate to be real. That mercy, offered without conditions, can outlast war. History remembers who won the war, but my family remembers who gave us water and asked for nothing in return. That is the ending that never made it into textbooks, yet it is the one that endured. And in a world still searching for reasons to believe that decency can survive conflict, it remains one of the quietest and strongest truths America ever left behind.